Bella Fleace Gave a Party by Evelyn Waugh. Ballingar is 4.5 hours from Dublin if you catch the early train from Broadstone Station, and 5.25 if you wait until the afternoon. It is the market town of a large and comparatively well-populated district. There is a pretty Protestant church in 1820 Gothic on one side of the square, and a vast unfinished Catholic cathedral opposite it, conceived in that irresponsible medley of architectural orders that is so dear to the hearts of transmontane pietists. Celtic lettering of a sort is beginning to take the place of the Latin alphabet on the shop fronts that complete the square. These all deal in identical goods in varying degrees of dilapidation. Mulligan stone, Flanagan stone, Riley stone, each sells thick black boots hanging in bundles, soapy colonial cheese, hardware and haberdashery, oil and saddlery, and each is licensed to sell ale and porter for consumption on or off the premises. The shell of the barracks stands with empty window frames and blackened interior as a monument to emancipation. Someone has written, "The Pope is a traitor," in tar on the green pillar box, a typical Irish town. Fleece Town is 15 miles from Ballinger, on a direct, uneven road through typical Irish country, vague purple hills in the far distance, and towards them, on one side of the road, fitfully visible among drifting patches of white mist, unbroken miles of bog, dotted with occasional stacks of cut peat. On the other side, the ground slopes up to the north, divided irregularly into spare fields by banks and stone walls over which the Ballingar hounds have some of their most eventful hunting. Moss lies on everything in a rough green rug on the walls and banks, soft green velvet on the timber, blurring the transitions so that there is no knowing where the ground ends and trunk and masonry begin. All the way from Ballingar there is a succession of whitewashed cabins and a dozen or so fair-sized farmhouses, but there is no gentleman's house, for all this was fleece property in the days before the Land Commission. The Dennisney land is all that belongs to Fleece Town now, and this is let for pasture to neighboring farmers. Only a few beds are cultivated in the walled kitchen garden. The rest has run to rot, thorned bushes barren of edible fruit spreading everywhere among weedy flowers, reverting rankly to type. The hot houses have been drafty skeletons for 10 years. The great gates set in their Georgian arch are permanently padlocked. The lodges are derelict, and the line of the main drive is only just discernible through the meadows. Access to a house is half a mile further up through a farm gate, along a track befouled by cattle. But the house itself, at the date with which we are dealing, was in a condition of comparatively good repair, compared, that is to say, with Ballinger House or Castle Boycott or Node Hall. It did not, of course, set up to rival Gordonstown, where the American Lady Gordon had installed electric light, central heating, and a lift, or Mock House or New Hill, which were leased to sporting Englishmen, or Castle Mockstock, since Lord Mockstock married beneath him. These 4 houses, with their neatly raked gravel, bathrooms, and dynamos, were the wonder and ridicule of the country, but Fleece Town, in fair comparison with the essentially Irish houses of the Free State, was unusually habitable. Its roof was intact, and in the roof, which makes the difference between the second and third grade of Irish country houses, and it is the roof which makes the difference between the second and third grade of Irish country houses. Once that goes, you have moss in the bedrooms, ferns on the stairs, and cows in the library, and in a very few years you have to move into the dairy or one of the lodges. But so long as he has literally a roof over his head, an Irishman's house is still his castle. There were weak bits in Fleece Town, but general opinion held that the Leeds were good for another 20 years and would certainly survive the present owner, Miss Annabel Rochfort Doyle Fleece. To give her the full name under which she appeared in books of reference, though she was known to the entire countryside as Bella Fleace, was the last of her family. There had been Fleeces and Flacers living around Ballinger since the days of Strongbow, and farm buildings marked the spot where they had inhabited a stockaded fort 2 centuries before the immigration of Boycotts or Gordons or Morestocks. A family tree emblazoned by a 19th century genealogist showing how the original stock had merged with the equally ancient Rochforts and the respectable, though more recent Doyles, hung in the billiard room. The present home had been built on extravagant lines in the middle of the 18th century, when the family, though enervated, was still wealthy and influential. It would be tedious to trace its gradual decline from fortune, although to say that it was due to no heroic debauchery. The Fleeces just got unobtrusively poorer in the way that families do who make no effort to help themselves. In the last generations, too, there had been marked traces of eccentricity. Bella Fleece's mother, the O'Hara of New Hill, had from the day of her marriage until her death suffered from the delusion that she was a negress. Her brother, from whom she had inherited, devoted himself to oil paintings. His mind ran on the simple subject of assassination, and before his death he had executed pictures of practically every such incident in history, from Julius Caesar to General Wilson. He was at work on a painting, his own murder, at the time of the Troubles, when he was, in fact, ambushed and done to death with a shotgun on his own drive. It was under one of her brother's paintings, Abraham Lincoln in his box at the theater, that Miss Fleece was sitting one colorless morning in November, when the idea came to her to give a Christmas party. It would be unnecessary to describe her appearance closely, and somewhat confusing, because it seemed in contradiction to much of her character. She was over 80, very untidy and very red. Streaky gray hair was twisted behind her head into a horsey bun. Wisps hung around her cheeks. Her nose was prominent and blue-veined. Her eyes pale blue, black and mad. She had a lively smile and spoke with a marked Irish intonation. She walked with the aid of a stick, having been lamed many years back when her horse rolled her among loose stones late in a long day. With the Ballinger hounds, a tipsy sporting doctor had completed the mischief, and she had not been able to ride again. She would appear on foot when hounds drew the Fleecetown coverlets and loudly criticized the conduct of the huntsman. But every year fewer of her old friends turned out. Strange faces appeared. They knew Bella, though she did not know them. She had become a byword in the neighborhood, a much-valued joke. "A rotten day," they would repeat. "But we found out, Fox. But lost again. Almost at once. But we saw Bella. Wonder how long the old girl will last. She must be nearly 90. My father remembers when she used to hunt. Went like smoke, too." Indeed, Bella herself was becoming increasingly occupied with the prospect of death. In the winter, before the one we are talking of, she had been extremely ill. She had emerged in April, rosy-cheeked as ever, but slower in her movements and mind. She gave instructions that better attention must be paid to her father's and brother's graves, and in June took the unprecedented step of inviting her heir to visit her. She had always refused to see this young man up till now. He was an Englishman, a very distant cousin named Banks. He lived in South Kensington and occupied himself in the museum. He arrived in August and wrote long and very amusing letters to all his friends describing his visit, and later translated his experiences into a short story for the Spectator. Bella disliked him from the moment he arrived. He had horn-rimmed spectacles and a BBC voice. He spent most of his time photographing the Fleecetown chimney-pieces and the molding of the doors. One day he came to Bella bearing a pile of calf-bound volumes from the library. I say, did you know you had these? He asked. I did, Bella lied. All first editions. They must be extremely valuable. You put them back where you found them? Later, when he wrote to thank her for his visit, enclosing prints of some of his photographs, he mentioned the books again. This set Bella thinking. Why should that young puppy go poking round the house, putting a price on everything? She wasn't dead yet, Bella thought. And the more she thought of it, the more repugnant it became to think of Archie Banks carrying off her books to South Kensington and removing the chimney pieces, and, as he threatened, writing an essay about the house for Architectural Review. She had often heard that the books were valuable. Well, there were plenty of books in the library, and she did not see why Archie Banks should profit by them, so she wrote a letter to a Dublin bookseller. He came to look through the library, and after a while, he offered her £1,200 for the lot, or £1,000 for the 6 books which had attracted Archie's attention. Bella was not sure that she had a right to sell things out of the house. A wholesale clearance would be noticed. So she kept the sermons and military history, which made up most of the collection. The Dublin bookseller went off with the first editions, which eventually fetched rather less than he had given, and Bella was left with winter coming on and £1,000 in hand. It was then that it occurred to her to give a party. There were always several parties given around Ballinger at Christmas time, but of late years Bella had not been invited to any, partly because many of her neighbors had never spoken to her, partly because they did not think she would want to come, and partly because they would not have known what to do with her if she had. As a matter of fact, she loved parties. She liked sitting down to supper in a noisy room. She liked dance music and gossip about which of the girls was pretty and who was in love with them, and she liked drink and having things brought to her by men in pink and evening coats. And though she tried to console herself with contemptuous reflection about the ancestry of the hostesses, it annoyed her very much whenever she heard of a party being given in the neighborhood to which she was not asked. And so it came about that, sitting with the Irish Times under a picture of Abraham Lincoln and gazing across the bare trees of the park to the hills beyond, Bella took it into her head to give a party. She rose immediately and hobbled across the room to the bell rope. Presently her butler came into the morning room. He wore the green baize apron in which he cleaned the silver, and in his hand he carried the plate brush to emphasize the irregularity of the summons. Was it yourself ringing? He asked. It was. Who else? I was at the silver. Riley, said Bella with some solemnity. I propose to give a ball at Christmas. Indeed, said her butler. And for what would you want to be dancing at your age? But Bella adumbrated her idea. A sympathetic light began to glitter. But as Bella adumbrated her idea, a sympathetic light began to glitter in Riley's eye. There's not been such a ball in the country for 25 years. It will cost a fortune. It will cost £1,000, said Bella proudly. The preparations were necessarily stupendous. 7 new servants were recruited in the village and set to work dusting and cleaning and polishing, clearing out furniture and pulling up carpets. Their industry served only to reveal fresh requirements. Plaster moldings, long rotten, crumbled under the feather brooms, worm-eaten mahogany floorboards came up with the tin tacks. Bare brick was disclosed behind the cabinets in the great drawing room. A second wave of the invasion brought painters, paper hangers, and plumbers, and in a moment of enthusiasm, Bella had the cornice and the capitals of the pillars in the hall re-gilded. Windows were reglazed, banisters fitted into gaping sockets, and the stair carpet shifted so that the worn strips were less noticeable. In all these works, Bella was indefatigable. She trotted from dancing room to hall, down the long gallery, up the staircase, admonishing the hireling servants, lending a hand with the lighter objects of furniture, sliding when the time came up, and down the mahogany floor of the drawing room to work in the French jock. She unloaded chests of silver in the attics, found long-forgotten services of china, went down with Riley into the cellars to count the few remaining and now flat and acrid bottles of champagne, flat and acid bottles of champagne, and in the evenings when the manual laborers had retired to their gross recreations, Bella sat up far into the night, turning the pages of cookery books, comparing the estimates of rival caterers, inditing long and detailed letters to the agents for dance bands, and most important of all, drawing up her list of guests and addressing the high double piles of engraved cards that stood in her escritoire. Distance counts for little in Ireland. People will readily drive 3 hours to pay an afternoon call, and for a dance of great importance, no journey was too great. Bella had her list painfully compiled from works of reference, Riley's more up-to-date social knowledge, and her own suddenly animated memory. Cheerfully, in a steady, childish handwriting, she transferred the names to the cards and addressed the envelopes. It was the work of several large sittings. Many of those whose names were transcribed were dead or bedridden. Some, whom she just remembered seeing as small children, were reaching retirement age in remote corners of the globe. Many of the houses she wrote down were blackened shells, burned during the Troubles and never rebuilt. Some had no one living in them, only farmers, but at last, none too early, the last envelope was addressed. A final lap with the stamps, and then, later than usual, she rose from the desk. Her limbs were stiff, her eyes dazzled, her tongue cloyed with the gum of the Free State Post Office. She felt a little dizzy, but she locked her desk that evening with the knowledge that the most serious part of the work of the pantry was over. There had been several notable and deliberate omissions from the list. "What's this I hear about Bella giving a party?" said Lady Gordon to Lady Mockstock. "I haven't had a card." "Neither have I yet. I hope the old thing hasn't forgotten me. I certainly intend to go. I've never been inside the house. I believe she's got some lovely things." With true English reserve, the lady whose husband had leased Mock Hall never betrayed the knowledge that any party was in the air at all at Fleecetown. As the last days approached, Bella concentrated more upon her own appearance. She had bought few clothes of recent years, and the Dublin dressmaker with whom she used to deal had shut up shop. For a delirious instant she played with the idea of a journey to London and even to Paris, and considerations of time alone obliged her to abandon it. In the end, she discovered a shop to suit her, and purchased a very magnificent gown of crimson satin. To this she added long white gloves and satin shoes. There was no tiara, alas, among her jewels, but she had unearthed large numbers of bright nondescript Victorian rings, some chains and lockets, pearl brooches, turquoise earrings, and a collar of garnets. She ordered a coiffeur down from Dublin to dress her hair. On the day of the ball she woke early, slightly feverish, with nervous excitement, and wriggled in bed till she was called, restlessly rehearsing in her mind every detail of the arrangements. Before noon she had been to supervise the setting of hundreds of candles in the sconces round the ballroom and supper room, and in the 3 great chandeliers of cut Waterford glass. She had seen the supper tables laid out with silver and glass, and stood the massive wine coolers by the buffet. She had helped back the staircase and hall with chrysanthemums. She had no luncheon that day, though Riley urged her with samples of the delicacies already arrived from the caterers. She felt a little faint, lay down for a short time, but rallied to sew with her own hands the crested buttons on the liveries of the hired servants. The invitations were timed for 8 o'clock. She wondered whether that were too early. She had heard tales of parties that began very late, but as the afternoon dragged on, unendurably, the rich twilight enveloped the house. Bella became glad she had set a short term on this exhausting wait. At 6, she went up to dress. The hairdresser was there with a bag full of tongs and combs. He brushed and coiled her hair, and whiffed it up and generally manipulated it until it became orderly and formal and apparently far more copious. She put on all her jewelry, and standing before the cheval glass in her room, could not forbear a gasp of surprise. Then she limped downstairs. The house looked magnificent in the candlelight. The band was there, the 12 hired footmen, Riley in knee breeches and black silk stockings. It struck 8. Bella waited. Nobody came. She sat down on a gilt chair at the head of the stairs, looked steadily before her with her blank blue eyes. In the hall, in the cloakroom, in the supper room, the hired footmen looked at one another with knowing winks. What does the old girl expect? No one will have finished dinner before tea. The linkmen on the steps stamped and chafed their hands. At 12:30, Bella rose from her chair. Her face gave no indication of what she was thinking. Riley, I think I will have some supper. I am not feeling altogether well. She hobbled slowly to the dining room. Give me a stuffed quail and a glass of wine. Tell the band to start playing. The Blue Danube waltz flooded the house. Bella smiled approval and swayed her head a little to the rhythm. Riley, I really am quite hungry. I've had nothing all day. Give me another quail and some more champagne. Alone among the curtains, the hired footman, Riley served his mistress with an immense supper. She enjoyed every mouthful. Presently she rose. I am afraid there must be some mistake. No one seems to be coming to the ball. It is very disappointing after all our trouble. You may tell the band to go home. But just as she was leaving the dining room, there was a stir in the hall. Guests were arriving. With wild resolution, Bella swung herself up the stairs. She must get to the top before the guests were announced. One hand on the banister, one on her stick, pounding heart 2 steps at a time. At last she reached the landing and turned to face the company. There was a mist before her eyes and a singing in her ears. She breathed with effort, but dimly she saw 4 figures advancing and saw Riley meet them and heard him announce, Lord and Lady Mockstock, Sir Samuel and Lady Gordon. Suddenly, the days in which she had been moving cleared. Here on the stairs were the 2 women she had not invited. Lady Mockstock, the draper's daughter, Lady Gordon, the American. She drew herself up and fixed them with her blank blue eyes. I had not expected the honour, she said. Please forgive me if I am unable to entertain you. The Mockstocks and the Gordons stood aghast, saw the mad blue eyes of their hostess, her crimson dress, the ballroom beyond, looking immense in its emptiness, heard the dance music echoing through the empty house. The air was charged with the scent of chrysanthemums, and then the drama and unreality of the scene were dispelled. Miss Fleace suddenly sat down, holding out her hands to her butler, and said, I don't quite know what's happening. He and 2 of the hired footmen carried the old lady to a sofa. She spoke only once more. Her mind was still on the same subject. They came uninvited, those 2, and nobody else. A day later she died. Mr. Banks arrived after the funeral and spent a week sorting out her effects. Among them, he found on her escritoire, stamped, addressed, but unposted, the invitations to the ball. And that's the end.